In the first years after World War II, the United States tried desperately to believe in peace. The soldiers had finally come home, factories had returned to consumer goods, and the nation fell into a rhythm of prosperity that felt almost unreal after years of total war. Suburbs spread across old farmland, families bought their first televisions, and the painful memories of the Pacific and Europe faded just enough for Americans to imagine that the world had turned a corner. But far across the ocean, events were already taking shape that would shatter that illusion. Asia had become a storm of competing ideologies and rival ambitions. In China, Mao Zedong's communists drove Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists off the mainland, forcing them to flee to Formosa, modern Taiwan. In Indochina, Vietnamese insurgents were eroding the foundations of French colonial power. And in Washington, the rise of Soviet influence created a growing fear that communism was spreading like an unstoppable tide. Senator Joseph McCarthy's accusations of communist infiltration within the government stirred national anxiety, and debates raged over which part of the world America needed to defend most urgently. Despite these tensions, the American military was battered by rapid demobilization. Division-sized units that had once stormed across Europe and Ireland, hopped through the Pacific, had been reduced to skeleton forces. Equipment rusted in depots, training standards dropped, and morale in many units was little more than a faint memory of past triumphs. American planners focused overwhelmingly on Europe, where the Soviet army, battle-hardened, massive, and still expanding, cast a long shadow over Western allies. Asia, by contrast, felt distant, secondary, and strategically unclear. And caught between these shifting superpowers lay a small fractured peninsula, Korea. For centuries, Korea had been invaded, divided, and dominated by its neighbors. A Korean proverb described the nation as a shrimp among whales, and history had rarely contradicted that grim image. Following Japan's surrender in 1945, Soviet forces swept into the north, and American troops entered the south. The wartime allies agreed to divide the country along an imaginary line, the 38th parallel, never imagining that this temporary occupation boundary would become one of the most dangerous borders on Earth. In the Soviet-controlled north, Kim Il-sung, a young guerrilla fighter with a talent for political theater and a gift for obedience to Moscow, became the face of a new regime built on Soviet principles. Factories, mines, and railroads fell under state control, and an army trained by Soviet officers took shape with alarming speed. In the American-controlled South, Syngman Rhee, an elderly, fiery nationalist who had spent decades advocating for Korean independence, took power with Washington's backing. His South Korea was poor, agrarian, politically chaotic, and deeply vulnerable. The United States, weary of foreign entanglements, saw the peninsula as a low-priority posting, a diplomatic Siberia, as some officials called it. Worse still, Secretary of State Dean Acheson publicly omitted South Korea from America's defensive perimeter in Asia, a message that did not go unnoticed in Pyongyang or Moscow. By 1948, both occupying powers had withdrawn, leaving behind two rival states, both claiming to be the rightful ruler of all Korea. Border clashes became routine. Artillery duels erupted across the 38th parallel. Raids, kidnappings, and propaganda broadcasts escalated weekly. Each side believed the other was illegitimate, temporary, and destined to collapse with just a little force. That force arrived on a quiet summer morning. At dawn on June 25, 1950, the North Korean People's Army unleashed a thunderous barrage along the entire parallel. Artillery shells tore into South Korean positions as Soviet-built T-34 tanks rolled south in tight armored formations. Columns of infantry swept behind them, 90,000 well-trained soldiers moving with precision and confidence. South Korean units, poorly armed and many literally on leave working in rice paddies, were overwhelmed in hours. Within a day, entire regiments ceased to exist. Roads filled with refugees streaming toward the south, pushing carts piled with their possessions, clutching children, dodging artillery bursts. American intelligence officers watching the first reports realized something chilling. This was no border raid. It was a full-scale invasion designed to swallow the entire peninsula before the outside world could react. In Washington, President Harry Truman hurried back from a weekend in Missouri as urgent cables arrived from Asia. The United Nations condemned the invasion, and Truman authorized air and naval support for South Korea. But as the North Koreans surged toward Seoul, it became clear that airstrikes alone would not stop the advance. The Korean Peninsula, barely noticed by most Americans just weeks earlier, had suddenly become the center of a global crisis. And for the men who would soon be sent to fight there, the tranquil peace of the post-war years was about to end forever. The thunder of the North Korean assault echoed across the peninsula long before American soldiers ever caught sight of the battlefield. By the second day of the invasion, it was clear that Seoul, the ancient capital of Korea, was doomed. South Korean defenses had collapsed so quickly that even seasoned American officers struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster. Roads clogged with civilians fleeing the capital, mothers pushing carts of blankets and rice, elderly men staggering under loads of household goods, students clutching books and family records as though they might anchor a world that was crumbling beneath their feet. The North Korean People's Army, hardened by Soviet advisors and equipped with T-34 tanks, advanced with a confidence that bordered on ferocity. Their infantry moved in disciplined waves, exploiting every gap in the defense. South Korean forces fought desperately, but most had never seen an armored vehicle, and their antiquated anti-tank weapons were useless against the thick steel hulls of Soviet machines. Entire South Korean units disintegrated under the pressure, some officers throwing off their insignia and attempting to blend into the crowds of refugees. Rumors of atrocities spread through the capital, intensifying the panic. President Syngman Rhee fled Seoul before the city fell, a decision that caused immense bitterness among his people. Within hours, the Han River Bridge, the last escape route from the city, was detonated prematurely while thousands of civilians were still crossing. Hundreds were killed instantly, their bodies thrown into the river as the center span collapsed. Survivors were left staring at the twisted wreckage, stunned by the cruelty of fate and the indifference of their own leaders. Meanwhile, across the Sea of Japan, the United States scrambled to respond. General Douglas MacArthur, still serving as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan, boarded a C-47 and flew directly to South Korea to assess the situation with his own eyes. What he saw shocked even him. Roads choked with refugees, soldiers retreating in confusion, and an enemy advancing with relentless speed. MacArthur sent an urgent message to Washington. Ground forces were needed immediately. But the troops available in Japan were a pale shadow of the army that had triumphed in 1945. Years of demobilization had left units understaffed, under-equipped, and undertrained. Many soldiers were occupation troops who had never expected to see combat again. Their weapons were old, their vehicles worn down, and their ammunition stocks limited. Yet they were ordered into battle at once. The first American unit to arrive was Task Force Smith, a hastily assembled battalion from the 21st Infantry Regiment of the 24th Division. Its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Brad Smith, received his orders with grim acceptance. Move north of Osan and delay the enemy as long as possible. What possible meant for a force of 540 lightly armed soldiers facing an armored spearhead was left unsaid. On July 5, 1950, Task Force Smith dug in on a ridgeline overlooking the highway. Rain soaked their uniforms, fog reduced visibility, and the men waited anxiously, clutching their rifles. When the first North Korean tanks appeared through the mist, sleek, dark, and moving in formation, Smith realized the truth. His men were about to face one of the most modern armored forces in Asia with Second World War weapons. The Americans fired recoilless rifles and bazookas, but almost none penetrated the tank's armor. The T-34s rolled through the line, firing their cannons as they passed, crushing foxholes and smashing artillery pieces. Behind them came waves of infantry. The Americans fought stubbornly, but by midday their position was overwhelmed. Smith gave the only order he could: retreat. Men sprinted through rice paddies, crawled through ditches, and dodged machine gun fire as the North Koreans closed in. Communications broke down. One machine gunner, the first recorded American combat death of the Korean War, was killed at his position, refusing to abandon his post. By the end of the day, Task Force Smith was shattered. Nearly a third of the battalion was dead, wounded, or missing. The delaying action had lasted only a few hours, but it marked America's rude awakening. This war would not be easy. More U.S. divisions arrived from Japan, but they too were thrown into battle before they were ready. Units were forced to fight piecemeal, plugging holes in the collapsing front line. The North Koreans captured one city after another, sweeping south like a storm tide. American artillery was limited, air support erratic, and supply lines chaotic. Heat, exhaustion, and confusion gnawed at every level of command. Again and again, American forces were pushed back, forming temporary defensive lines only to abandon them under pressure. By mid-July, the United Nations forces, American, South Korean, and small contingents from allied nations, were retreating toward a shrinking pocket in the southeast corner of the peninsula. This last stand would later be called the Pusan Perimeter. It was a narrow crescent of territory anchored around the port city of Busan, the final lifeline through which reinforcements and supplies could arrive. If the perimeter fell, the entire Korean Peninsula would be lost. General Walton Walker, commanding the U.S. 8th Army in Korea, issued a stark, unforgettable order to his exhausted soldiers. There will be no retreat. There will be no Dunkirk. There will be no Bataan. We will hold this line. For the men along the perimeter, the message was both a warning and a vow. They dug trenches into bone-dry hillsides, strung barbed wire across ridge lines, and waited for the next assault. Each night, the North Koreans probed the defenses. Each dawn brought new casualties, but the line held. And in the distance, across the ocean, ships were gathering, ships carrying reinforcements who would soon arrive and change the course of the war. The fate of South Korea now rested on a thin, battered crescent of earth, and on whether the men defending it could endure the next storm. By late August 1950, the Pusan perimeter had become a cauldron. 40,000 square kilometers of battered earth, dug-in foxholes, and exhausted soldiers who fought every day on the razor's edge between survival and annihilation. The North Korean army launched attack after attack, throwing tanks, infantry, and artillery against the shrinking United Nations line. At times, the defenders were pushed back so far that the sea was visible behind them. Yet somehow, the perimeter held. Every mile of ground cost blood. Every ridge was won and lost, and won again. The Americans and South Koreans did not know it yet, but their desperate stand had bought Douglas MacArthur something he needed even more than soldiers: time. Time to plan an audacious blow that would change the course of the war. MacArthur believed from the first days of the conflict that simply reinforcing the perimeter and pushing north would lead to a grinding, expensive campaign. He wanted something bold, something that would break the enemy's spine in a single stroke. His mind returned again and again to one idea: an amphibious assault deep behind enemy lines, severing North Korea's supply routes and isolating the bulk of its forces in the south. His chosen target was Inchon. Any other commander might have dismissed the idea immediately. Inchon was considered one of the worst landing sites in the world. Its tides varied by more than 30 feet, exposing vast mudflats at low tide. Navigating the narrow channels required precise timing. If the landing craft arrived too late or too early, they would run aground, immobilized under enemy fire. Even the Joint Chiefs of Staff hesitated, sending generals to Tokyo to talk MacArthur out of the idea. But MacArthur was unmoved. He believed the very dangers of Inchon made it the perfect place. The North Koreans would not expect an attack where no rational commander would dare to send one. As the debates raged in Washington, preparations moved forward quietly in Japan. Marines from the 1st Marine Division trained relentlessly for the operation, knowing little about where they would land but sensing the scale of what was coming. Equipment was pulled from storage, refurbished, repainted. Replacements filled the ranks. Warships gathered offshore like steel sentinels waiting for the signal to advance. The first test came at the tiny island of Volmi-do, which guarded the harbor approaches. Before dawn on September 15, 1950, naval guns opened fire. Battleships and cruisers hurled shells into the enemy fortifications, sending shockwaves through the harbor. As smoke and dust rose over the island, the Marines moved in. The fighting was fierce but brief. Within hours, the American flag was raised on Radio Hill, signaling the first step of the invasion had succeeded. Then, as the tides again shifted, the sea carried in the main assault force. At 5:33 p.m., the first waves of Marines reached Red Beach, scaling seawalls under machine gun fire. Others stormed Blue Beach to the south, clawing their way past concrete defenses and bunkers. Inchon itself erupted in flames as rockets and napalm struck enemy positions. Civilians huddled in basements as the city shook under bombardment. By nightfall, 13,000 United Nations troops were ashore. The North Koreans, stunned by the scale and audacity of the operation, resisted fiercely, but without coordination. Inchon fell within 24 hours. Supplies poured across the beaches. Tanks rolled inland. Artillery pieces thudded into position. And with breathtaking speed, the Marines turned east toward Seoul. The road to the capital was not a simple advance. It was a gauntlet. Enemy reinforcements rushed toward the city, knowing that if Seoul fell, their armies in the south would be cut off. Bridges were blown, ambushes set, and entire factories were converted into defensive fortresses. The industrial suburb of Yeongdongpo became a landscape of rubble and fire as Marines fought street by street, clearing machine gun nests among collapsed warehouses. On the northern flank, the 5th Marine Regiment moved toward Kimpo Airfield, a strategic prize that would allow American transport planes to land within miles of Seoul. After a brutal fight, the airfield fell, and American C-54 transports began landing within hours, disgorging supplies and reinforcements that would fuel the coming drive into the city. By September 22nd, the assault on Seoul began in earnest. The Marines advanced through shattered neighborhoods filled with barricades, booby traps, and snipers hidden in half-ruined buildings. Fighting raged from rooftop to basement. Enemy soldiers fought with fanatic determination, holding intersections for hours before being driven back, only to reappear deeper in the city. The battle for each block was paid for in blood. Every night, the capital burned. On September 25th, MacArthur declared Seoul liberated. though fighting still echoed through its streets for 2 more days. When the last pockets of resistance collapsed, exhausted North Korean soldiers tried to flee north, only to find the roads blocked by rapidly advancing United Nations forces. Thousands surrendered. Thousands more were trapped. In the south, Walker's 8th Army broke out of the Pusan perimeter, surging north with a strength that weeks earlier had seemed impossible. American and South Korean troops advanced rapidly, reuniting with the Inchon landing force near Osan. The North Korean army, once seemingly unstoppable, now collapsed in disarray. The tide had turned. In less than 2 weeks, the United Nations had reversed the entire course of the war. Seoul was back in South Korean hands. North Korean armies were fleeing in confusion. And for the first time since June, the prospect of complete victory seemed within reach. Yet even as celebrations erupted in Seoul, and optimists spoke of the war ending by Christmas, a new and far more dangerous force was gathering in the mountains to the north, watching, waiting, and preparing to strike. The war, far from ending, was about to enter its most brutal phase. The autumn of 1950 was filled with a strange, contradictory mixture of triumph and foreboding. United Nations forces, riding the momentum of the Inchon landing and the stunning liberation of Seoul, surged north across the 38th parallel. Columns of American tanks rolled through captured towns as cheering South Koreans waved flags along the roadside. Supply trucks roared forward in endless convoys. Officers spoke openly of reaching the Yalu River, the border with Manchuria, before winter, and many soldiers believed they would be home by Christmas. The enemy, they were told, was shattered. Victory seemed inevitable. But beneath the surface, something was wrong. General Walton Walker's 8th Army, advancing up the western side of the peninsula, encountered sporadic resistance, but nothing like the ferocious battles of June and July. North Korean units seemed to melt away, leaving behind scattered pockets of troops who surrendered by the hundreds. Intelligence officers in Tokyo began to issue confident assessments. The North Korean army was collapsing, organized resistance was ending, and the war had reached its final mopping up phase. Yet reports from the front told a different story. Patrols returning from the dark, jagged mountains near the Yalu spoke of strange encounters, ambushes launched by disciplined, unfamiliar troops, bugles sounding from the hills at night, wounded enemy soldiers wearing uniforms that did not match North Korean patterns. Prisoners taken in firefights claimed to be Chinese volunteers, though headquarters dismissed these assertions as propaganda or misidentification. The idea that China might enter the war was considered unlikely, even absurd. MacArthur himself insisted that if China intervened at all, it would be in limited numbers, unable to affect the final outcome. But China had already intervened, silently, massively, and with ruthless precision. In early October, as UN troops crossed the 38th parallel, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers from the 4th Field Army and the 9th Army Group slipped across the Yalu under cover of night. They moved without headlights, guided by local Koreans along narrow mountain trails. Their uniforms were padded for winter, their supplies minimal, their discipline absolute. They did not use radios. They did not light fires. They marched with straw tied to their boots to muffle their steps. In the frozen valleys of North Korea, an enormous army materialized like a phantom force. Still, warnings were dismissed. In Washington, policymakers feared provoking a wider war with China or even the Soviet Union. In Tokyo, MacArthur's intelligence chief insisted that any Chinese presence was minor. And so, the advance continued, deeper and deeper into the mountains, where icy winds from Siberia swept across ridgelines and the temperature dropped below zero. On November 24th, MacArthur launched the Home by Christmas Offensive, a grand push meant to end the war. At key forward positions, near Unsan in the west and the Chosin Reservoir in the east, American troops donned extra layers against the cold, loaded their rifles with numbed fingers, and prepared to attack. Major General Edward Allman, commander of X Corps, flew to the northernmost outpost and posed for photographs while telling his men they would soon reach the Yalu. The Chinese watched from the hills. That night, the mountains erupted. Like a tidal wave crashing down from the darkened heights, tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers surged toward UN positions. They attacked without artillery support, blowing bugles and shouting war cries that echoed across frozen valleys. Human wave assaults smashed into frontline units, overwhelming them with sheer numbers. Mortars rained down, machine guns blazed in the darkness. American and South Korean soldiers, stunned and scattered, struggled to hold their lines as the temperature plunged to 30 degrees C. Frostbite set in within minutes. Weapons jammed. Blood froze on the ground. It was the beginning of one of the most devastating defeats in American military history. On the Western Front, Walker's 8th Army suffered catastrophic losses. Entire units were pushed back across the Inchon River. Some regiments were torn apart, retreating in small clusters under relentless pressure. Roads clogged with refugees fleeing the renewed fighting, old men dragging carts, children wrapped in blankets, women carrying their last possessions. Tanks and trucks attempted to push through the crowds as artillery thundered behind them. It was a scene of chaos reminiscent of the earliest days of the war, only colder, darker, and infinitely more desperate. In the east, the catastrophe was even greater. The 1st Marine Division and elements of the 7th Infantry Division had advanced into the mountains surrounding the Chosin Reservoir, unaware that they were marching into a trap. Chinese forces encircled them completely, sealing off the road south. When the first attack struck on November 27th, Marines woke to the sound of bugles and the sight of entire hillsides coming alive with attacking troops. Fighting raged through the night, muzzle flashes lighting the snow as Marines fixed bayonets and fought at close range. By dawn, the truth was undeniable. They were surrounded. The cold itself became an enemy. Engines froze solid. Sea rations turned to blocks of ice. Morphine syrettes needed to be warmed in a corpsman's mouth before use. Men suffered frostbite so severe that fingers and toes turned black. Those who were wounded faced a grim fate. Blood froze on bandages, and those lying on the ground risked freezing to death before medical help could reach them. General Oliver P. Smith, the Marine commander, refused to panic. He ordered his men to dig in and hold their positions at key villages along the mountain road, Udamni, Hagaruri, Kotori. These names would enter Marine Corps legend. Smith delivered a line that captured both the desperation and determination of the moment. Retreat? Hell, we're not retreating. We're just advancing in another direction. The breakout began. For 2 weeks, the Marines fought their way south, hill by hill, ambush by ambush, while Chinese forces struck from every ridge and valley. Air support became the lifeline. Marine pilots flew through blizzards, dropping ammunition, food, and medical supplies to the frozen troops. At one critical point, when the Chinese blew a bridge and cut off the only escape route, engineers parachuted in prefabricated bridge sections under heavy fire. Within hours, the Marines had built a new bridge over a 70-foot chasm and continued their escape. Behind them, the snow was stained with blood. On December 11th, the battered survivors reached the port of Hungnam. Navy ships waited offshore, their decks illuminated under a gray winter sky. The evacuation that followed was one of the largest in American history. Over 100,000 troops and nearly as many civilians were taken out by sea. As the last ships departed on Christmas Eve, explosives detonated across the harbor, destroying supplies that could not be moved. Flames and smoke billowed into the sky as the coastline collapsed behind them. The home by Christmas dream had become a nightmare. The war was no longer a rapid march to victory, but a struggle for survival, and soon the conflict would enter a new, grinding phase that neither side had foreseen. The winter of 1950-51 left the Korean Peninsula scarred in ways that would never fully heal. The Chinese intervention had transformed a war of movement into a desperate retreat. Cities changed hands, tens of thousands of soldiers were lost, and the hope of a swift victory evaporated into the frozen winds blowing off the Yalu. As United Nations forces regrouped south of Seoul, the conflict entered a new phase, one defined not by bold offensives or sweeping territorial gains, but by strategy, attrition, and political pressure on an international scale. The war that had begun suddenly raced across the peninsula and reversed direction twice, now slowed into something darker, a brutal, grinding stalemate. General Walton Walker, who had commanded the 8th Army since the early days of the war, was killed in a jeep accident on December 23, 1950. His death came at a moment when morale had already collapsed. Units were shattered, men exhausted, and confidence shaken by the scale of the Chinese onslaught. Into this chaotic situation stepped General Matthew B. Ridgway, a paratrooper commander from World War II, known for his disciplined leadership and his refusal to accept defeat. Ridgway arrived in Korea wearing grenades clipped to his vest and a Bible in his pocket, a symbolic reminder that he intended to be both a fighter and a stabilizing force. Ridgway immediately addressed the most pressing issue: morale. He visited frontline units, walked through trenches still slick with frozen mud, and spoke directly with soldiers. He saw fear in their eyes, but also resilience. He reorganized command structures, restored artillery coordination, demanded aggressive patrolling, and focused on winning back the initiative inch by inch. By early January 1951, Chinese forces again pushed south, forcing UN troops to withdraw from Seoul. But this time, instead of collapsing, the 8th Army bent, absorbed the blow, and held. The Chinese suffered staggering casualties. Their logistics, the lifeblood of any army, were strained to the breaking point by mountainous terrain, extreme cold, and relentless American air power. While they had numbers, they lacked trucks, winter clothing, and heavy artillery. Many Chinese soldiers froze to death in foxholes or simply starved in mountain passes. Ridgway saw an opportunity. In late January, he launched small probing attacks, Operation Thunderbolt, designed to test Chinese positions and gradually push them back. These were not grand offensives like the Inchon landing. Instead, they were methodical advances, supported by artillery and airstrikes, backed by defensive positions at every stage. Slowly, the UN line moved north. By mid-February, Seoul was once again within reach. Chinese forces launched their own counterattacks, but their momentum had faded. The ferocity of earlier offensives gave way to disorganized pushes that collapsed under concentrated fire. On March 14, 1951, UN forces retook Seoul for the second time. This recapture was different from the jubilant one in September. The city was a burned, shattered skeleton. Bridges lay in the river, toppled from repeated demolitions. Streets were lined with rubble. Civilians who had survived the winter moved like shadows through the ruins, scavenging for wood and food. The city had changed hands 4 times. Each time the price had been immense. As Ridgway regained control of the battlefield, a different battle erupted half a world away between General Douglas MacArthur and President Harry Truman. MacArthur believed that the Chinese threat could only be ended by expanding the war, bombing Manchurian bases, blockading Chinese ports, and possibly even using nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan. Truman, wary of provoking a Third World War with nuclear consequences, insisted that the conflict remain limited to Korea. Their disagreement escalated into a public feud. MacArthur, accustomed to the near worship he received in Tokyo and the adulation following Inchon, began speaking directly to Congress, the press, and allies, bypassing the president. His statements implied that Truman was preventing victory, that political caution was costing American lives, and that he, MacArthur, alone understood how to win the war. The tension became untenable. On April 11, 1951, Truman relieved MacArthur of his command. The decision shocked the world. When MacArthur returned to the United States, he was greeted by millions during a triumphant parade. He delivered a stirring address to Congress, one of the most famous speeches in American history, ending with the words, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." But the war did not fade. It ground on relentlessly, even as one of its most iconic commanders departed the stage. With Ridgway taking over as Supreme UN Commander and General James Van Fleet assuming command of the Eighth Army, the war entered its most static and deadly chapter. The front line stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel, where the conflict had begun. Now, instead of sweeping offensives, soldiers dug trenches across Korea's mountains, lines of earthworks, bunkers, and barbed wire reminiscent of World War I. The battles of 1951 and 1952 were fights for hills, small, steep, vicious pieces of terrain whose names would become synonymous with carnage: Bloody Ridge, Heartbreak Ridge, the Punch Bowl, Pork Chop Hill, Old Baldy. These heights provided observation advantage, artillery control, or simply symbolic dominance. Units fought for them repeatedly, often losing and recapturing the same ground within days. Casualties mounted. Prisoners were taken and sometimes killed. Artillery thunder became the constant soundtrack of the war. Meanwhile, peace negotiations began in July 1951 at Kaesong and later moved to Panmunjom. What should have been a relatively simple settlement, both sides were now on nearly the same lines, dragged on for 2 years. Every aspect of the truce became an argument: the exact position of the demarcation line, the creation of a demilitarized zone, the method of prisoner repatriation. The most bitter dispute centered on whether prisoners would be forced to return to their home countries. Many Chinese and North Korean prisoners refused to be repatriated, fearing execution or imprisonment. The UN insisted on voluntary return. The communists demanded forced repatriation. The stalemate in negotiations mirrored the stalemate on the battlefield. The war, once defined by dramatic swings of momentum, now seemed endless. In the United States, public support eroded. Families posed a painful question: why were their sons dying on remote hills for territory that a future armistice would return to the enemy anyway? The term, "the Forgotten War," began to circulate, describing a conflict overshadowed by World War II's glory and the emerging anxieties of the Cold War. Then, in March 1953, a seismic event shifted the political landscape. Joseph Stalin died. The new Soviet leadership was more willing to negotiate, and China, exhausted by casualties and supply shortages, followed suit. Momentum finally shifted toward peace. In April, the two sides conducted Operation Little Switch, the exchange of sick and wounded prisoners. It was a small step, but hopeful. After further talks, they began preparations for a final exchange, Operation Big Switch, returning tens of thousands of captured troops. Finally, after months of bargaining, drafting, delaying, and rephrasing, an armistice agreement was prepared. On July 27, 1953, At 10:03 a.m., in the village of Panmunjom, United Nations General William K. Harrison and North Korean General Nam Il signed the ceasefire documents. There was no handshake, no celebration, just pens scratching paper, the snapping of cameras, and then silence. The guns finally fell quiet. The war had lasted 3 years, 1 month, and 2 days. The border remained almost exactly where it had been in 1950. No peace treaty was ever signed, only an armistice, a pause in a conflict that technically has never fully ended. More than 2 million Koreans died. 35,000 Americans were killed, over 100,000 wounded. Cities were destroyed, families torn apart, and the peninsula divided permanently by a wound that endures to this day. When the news reached the United States, there were no parades, no great celebrations. Most Americans simply felt relief that the ordeal was over. Korea faded quickly from the headlines as Europe rearmed for the Cold War and new crises emerged around the globe. Veterans returned to their lives with little fanfare, carrying memories of frozen mountains, burning cities, and comrades who never came home. The Korean War became the war between wars, overshadowed by the one that came before it and the one that loomed afterward. But its impact was profound. It marked the first major conflict of the Cold War, the first test of the United Nations collective security, and the beginning of a permanent American military presence in Asia. It shaped the geopolitics of the region for decades to come. And though history would call it the Forgotten War, the men who fought across those ridgelines understood the truth. It was a war of immense sacrifice, fought under impossible conditions, in a land split by ideology and tragedy. A war that ended not with victory or defeat, but with silence, and a promise that peace, fragile and unfinished, would hold.